Hi, welcome to Diamonds and Crochet. Thank you for joining me today. I wanted to talk yarn today. I kind of wanted to talk about how I plan buying my yarn for my projects, the kinds of yarns that I choose to use and why I choose to use them. I tend to be someone who reads patterns. I tend to work off of a pattern. Sometimes when I'm making a throw blanket, I don't do that. Sometimes when I'm making a simple scarf or cowl or hat, I just make one for myself. But generally speaking, if I'm making myself a garment or a garment for somebody else or a shawl or something, I'm almost always going off of a pattern. So the first thing that I do is I look at what the pattern suggests, whether it be wool, acrylic, or cotton. I look at the weight that it wants me to use, whether that be DK, worsted, sport, bulky. So that's always a very good indicator. If you have a yarn that you're not quite sure if it fits, some companies weigh their yarns differently. Some worsted yarns are on the thinner side and some are on the thicker side. So sometimes you generally don't know. A good way of gauging that is you would want to look up the yarn that the pattern recommends. Some patterns recommend more than one. Some patterns recommend some budget-friendly options, and some patterns recommend some luxury yarn options. I really like those patterns. They're very inclusive for all budgets. But the best way is to look up the yarn that the pattern recommends. Most patterns always recommend some type of a yarn. That yarn will give you some information. Let's say that it's this. Let's say that the pattern recommends Lion Brand Heartland yarn. The yarn will tell you the weight. This says 5 ounces. 142 grams, and then underneath that it tells you how much length you have of yarn, 251 yards or 230 meters. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to look at the yarn you have, figure out if it's similar weight, and then if the yardage or the meter is similar to the weight, chances are it's going to be a good match. If it's off a little bit and you're not sure still, work up a gauge square. This is one of my gauge squares for a previous pattern I made. And it will tell you how many inches to measure from your gauge square. So let's say it was 4 inches. You're going to want to measure the rows in the 4 inches down. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you're going to want to measure in inches across. 1, 2, 3, 4. Obviously, I'm not actually measuring out in inches, but if that was, let's say it was 4 rows up and 4 rows across, and you have that in your measurements, then that's great. That means your yarn with that hook matches gauge. Let's say you have extra, you have too many within the measurement for gauge. That means you're using too small of a hook. You want to size up a hook. If the pattern called for a size 5, try it with a size 6. If you're not matching gauge, if you have too many, if you're working up too many, so you have fewer rows than you're supposed to have, that means you're using too large of a hook. If the pattern called for a size 5, try using a size 4. That's a good way of using the yarn you have to match the project if you don't want to buy new yarn for a project. So that's always the first thing I look at when I'm picking out yarn for a pattern. I look at what the pattern suggests that I use. The next thing that I think about is I think about how often am I going to use this piece is this going to be an everyday worn piece? If that's the case, I might want to look for something that's more anti-pilling. A lot of companies, I know Lion Brand does, I know Premier Yarn does, probably Red Heart does as well. They have a basic stitch yarn that is anti-pilling acrylic. They're usually very budget friendly. I love to use those when I'm making a pattern for my nieces, because I know those pieces are going to be worn. They're not going to be too careful with them. They're going to get washed more regularly. So you want a more durable yarn. Even for myself, sometimes when I'm making a cardi sweater or something like that, I'll use basic stitch, because I want to make sure it's going to be durable for the wear that I use it. If it's a sweater that's more fancy looking, like for me, that's more intricate. I have an example of what I'm talking about. For me, this is a more fancy sweater. It's not necessarily an everyday worn sweater. A sweater like that, which I did for this, I'll splurge on some hand-dyed yarn. This was Moon Milk by Fuzzy Peach Fibers. The sweater pattern is the Isolla sweater. I'll put her name in the description. Her first name's Linda. I don't want to mispronounce her last name. It's a foreign last name. So I'll put the name of the pattern, where I found it, and the name of the pattern creator in the description. But that sweater to me was a very intricate, special pattern design. So I wanted to buy a more special yarn to make that up with. You can find budget. You don't have to just buy from independent or indie yarn dyers for hand-dyed yarn. There's companies that do it. This is Malabrigo. It's their sock yarn in the color Persia. This is a hand-dyed yarn. It's still more expensive than your basic acrylic, but it's typically less expensive than independent hand-dyed yarn dyers. I bought that to make a sweater with. And you can buy, if you want to try wool and you're really on a budget. This is from Premier Yarns. It's their Stitch Please. It's 100% wool. This is their worsted. It's in the colorway Berry Much. It's a little bit more scritchy on the skin. So I bought this to make a cardigan with, because typically when I'm wearing a cardigan, I have a shirt on underneath it. So I put it on over what I'm wearing. So this is a nice budget wool. If I'm making something that's striped, if I'm making granny squares, if I'm making a blanket like this, one of the tips or tricks that I use is I stick within the same line. So going back to the Heartland, if I wanted to make a striped blanket with this color in it, but I didn't have any other colors picked out yet, I would look at the Heartland line to find my other colors. I would stick within the Lion Brand Heartland line, because chances are every line of yarn is going to be made to be compatible with each other. So the colors in every line, generally speaking, pair well with each other. So that's a good tip and trick. If you're using bright colors, I would stick with bright colors. I wouldn't mix and match brights with like earthy tones. Generally speaking, if you do that, it looks a little off and you can't quite place why. So if you're really wanting a bright color, find other bright colors to pair with it. If you really like that terracotta red, find some, like olive greens or other earthy tones to kind of go with that. Generally speaking, sticking with brights or sticking with earthy tones like that pairs well. The project looks more put together. Like this blanket right here, I got from Hobie Yarns. I can't remember exactly what line it was, but it was all within the same line, so I knew that they would pair well together. So that's a good tip and trick. If you're buying from an independent yarn dyer, a lot of indie yarn dyers bundle skeins made specifically for that purpose. They'll bundle 4 or 5, sometimes I've seen them even bundle up to 12 colors together, made for either a fade sweater or a striped sweater or a shawl. The colors are designed to pair together. Some indie dyers put out collections. Generally speaking, if they do that, the colors in the collections are going to pair well together. So if you did want to splurge for a shawl from an indie dyer, you can do that too. That's a good option. Those are my tips and tricks for that. So you don't have to just buy from indie dyers or more budget friendly. There is mid-range yarns. I got this from Webs, which is a company in Massachusetts. It's yarn.com. It's Universal Yarns, Bella Cash. It's in the colorway Emerald. It's kind of tucked up in there, but it is called Emerald. This was a little bit more expensive than your budget yarn, but it's not Malabrigo price. Tripping on my words there. So this was kind of a mid-range yarn. I bought that to make a sweater with. And then Lion Brand has the LB collection range yarn now, which is a little bit more expensive than their basic yarns, but it's still affordable. This is their merino camel, and I bought that to make a sweater with as well. So there are options out there, not just, you know, budget friendly and not just the luxury. There is some mid-range yarns out there if you look for them. Yarn.com, Webs, Lovecraft.com, that's another brand, another company out there that sells some yarns that are more mid-range. So there's options. I guess that's all I wanted to say for today. If you have some questions, please ask them. I would love to answer them. I'm not sure what kind of information people need. I tried to go over all of the questions I'm used to being asked by my family and friends. But if you have other questions, please ask them. I would love to know what they are, and I would love to be able to answer them for you. I thank everyone who stopped by for joining me today. I hope you have a great day. Bye.